Hey guys, in tonight's video, we're diving into the crazy and insane world of King Henry VIII's 6 wives. Their tragic stories of secrecy, pain, strategy, and the lucky tale of the one who got away. But before we begin, if you enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get started. Imagine stepping into a world where your future doesn't belong to you, where your world is measured not by your character, but by the children you can produce, preferably sons. This was the dangerous stage upon which 6 extraordinary women were forced to play their roles, all bound to one man, King Henry VIII of England. Henry is remembered as the larger-than-life monarch who broke with the Catholic Church, changed the course of English history, and left behind a bloody trail of ambition and power. But while his name looms large, the stories of his wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, are where the real drama lies. These weren't just queens. They were pawns, partners, scapegoats, and survivors caught in the storm of a king's ruthless obsession with legacy. Some were forced into marriages they never even wanted. Others clawed their way to the throne through charm and intelligence, only to be discarded, or worse, when they failed to live up to Henry's impossible demands. Their lives were filled with betrayal, manipulation, and the constant shadow of the executioner's axe. And yet, within these tragedies, we find moments of resilience, courage, and cunning proof that even in the gilded cage of Tudor life, these women found ways to leave their mark. So today we're diving into the messy, scandalous, and often heartbreaking saga of Henry VIII's 6 wives. From the devoted queen cast aside after decades of loyalty, to the dazzling young woman whose ambition cost her head, to the lucky survivor who outlived the king himself. Each of their stories reveals not just the brutality of life under Henry, but also the strength it took to endure him. This isn't just a tale of royal marriages. It's a cautionary drama of power, patriarchy, and survival. But to truly understand this saga, we have to start at the very beginning, with the woman who would spend more than 2 decades as Henry's queen, and who fought harder than any one of his wives to keep her crown, Catherine of Aragon. Catherine wasn't just anyone. She was born in 1485, the youngest daughter of the powerful monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same rulers who had united Spain into a global superpower and financed Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. From the moment of her birth, Catherine's life was a political chess piece, designed to secure alliances and strengthen dynasties. She grew up in a court that valued learning, faith, and duty, and she was exceptionally well educated for a woman of her time. Fluent in Latin, skilled in diplomacy, and deeply religious, Catherine carried herself with the poise of a queen long before she ever set foot in England. Her destiny was sealed when she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King Henry VII. This was a union meant to tie England and Spain together against common enemies like France, a marriage of great political importance. Catherine traveled to England in 1501, and at just 16 years old, she married Arthur in a grand ceremony that dazzled London. But her new life as Princess of Wales was cut tragically short. Within months, Arthur fell ill, most likely with the mysterious sweating sickness, and died, leaving Catherine a widow at only 17 years old. Suddenly, the Grand Alliance was in jeopardy, but Catherine's story, it didn't end there. Instead of sending her back to Spain, negotiations began to marry her to Arthur's younger brother, the boy who would one day become King Henry VIII. For years, Catherine remained in England in a kind of political limbo, caught between two kingdoms. Her dowry, her future, and her very honor became bargaining chips in the tense negotiations between her father and King Henry VII. When the old king finally died in 1509, the young, charismatic Henry VIII ascended the throne, and within weeks, he married Catherine. At 23, she became Queen of England, beloved by the people and celebrated as the perfect match for the energetic new king. Catherine brought with her not just royal blood, but also the dignity, education, and determination that would define her long reign as Henry's first, and, in her eyes only, his true wife. At first, Catherine and Henry seemed like the ultimate power couple. He was young, handsome, athletic, basically the Tudor version of a Renaissance jock. And she was cultured, elegant, and already knew how to queen better than most women ever dreamed. Together, they looked like a royal fairy tale, and for a while, it actually was. Henry wrote her love letters, jousted in her honor, and paraded her around like a prized jewel. Catherine adored him, and Henry, at least in the beginning, seemed just as smitten. But here's the catch. Henry VIII was obsessed with one thing above all else, producing a male heir. Sons were the currency of dynasties, the insurance policy for the Tudor line. And Catherine? She tried. Oh, did she try? Over the years, she endured multiple pregnancies, most of them ending in tragedy. She gave birth to stillborn children, infants who lived only days, and finally, one surviving daughter, Mary, who would one day become the infamous Bloody Mary. But to Henry, a daughter wasn't good enough. He wanted a boy to carry his name, lead his armies, and secure his precious throne. At first, Henry was patient. After all, Catherine was devout, intelligent, and genuinely respected by the English people. But as the years passed and no son arrived, Henry's frustration, it started to boil. He began to convince himself that God was punishing him, that by marrying his brother's widow, he'd cursed his own reign. Because obviously it couldn't be possibly his fault. It was a classic Henry move. And here's where things went from slightly rocky to full-on soap opera. Instead of just facing reality like a grown man, Henry decided the solution was to completely blow up the English relationship with the Pope, the Catholic Church, and, well, Europe. All because he wanted a different wife who could give him a son. Catherine, of course, refused to step aside quietly. She fought tooth and nail, declaring herself Henry's rightful wife and queen. In fact, she once confronted him in court, dramatically kneeling before him and declaring that she had been a true and loyal wife. It was the Tudor equivalent of dropping the mic. But in the end, Henry had all the power, and Catherine was cast aside, banished from court, separated from her daughter Mary, and forced to spend her final years in isolation. Yet even in defeat, Catherine never wavered. To her dying day, she insisted that she was the rightful Queen of England and Henry's lawful wife. And honestly, she deserved way better. So Catherine is shoved off the Tudor stage, left heartbroken, but still clinging to her title. And who strolls in to steal the spotlight? Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't your typical Tudor court lady. She spent most of her time in the glittering courts of France, soaking up all the sophistication, style, and charm of the continent. She was sharp, witty, fashionable, and way more captivating than the average English noblewoman. Basically, she was the 16th century version of that girl everyone at court was whispering about. Mysterious, stylish, and dangerously confident. Henry, of course, he was instantly hooked. But here's the twist. Anne wasn't about to be just another one of Henry's flings. No, she was far too clever for that. Instead of giving in to the king's advances, she played the long game, keeping him at arm's length and dangling the possibility of marriage in front of him like a carrot on a stick. And Henry? He chased after that carrot for 7 long years. During that time, Anne basically turned Henry's life completely upside down. He wrote her passionate letters, sometimes embarrassing ones, because this was a guy who wasn't used to not getting his way. He even gave her the nickname Sweetheart, which sounds sweet until you remember this is the same man who later chopped her head off. But Anne's ambitions weren't just about marrying a king. She wanted to be queen. And to make that happen, Henry had to find a way to ditch Catherine. Cue the Great Divorce, the epic shutdown with the Pope, and Henry screaming, "Fine, I'll make my own church," with blackjack and annulments. Thus, the Church of England was born because one guy couldn't take no for an answer. And finally, Anne, she got what she wanted, a crown. In 1533, she married Henry and was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony. She was pregnant soon after, and Henry was convinced she was carrying his long-awaited son. But when the baby arrived, it wasn't a boy, it was a girl. And not just any girl, but the future Queen Elizabeth I, one of the greatest rulers in English history. Henry, however, he wasn't impressed. He wanted a son, and Anne had given him yet another daughter. And that's when Anne's fairy tale started spiraling into a nightmare. At first, Anne's reign as queen was electric. She had finally gone from lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon to the center of power herself. She was witty, quick with comebacks, and had the kind of charisma that made half the court adore her and the other half absolutely despise her. People nicknamed her the most happy, and for a while, she really was. But Henry wasn't an easy man to keep happy. Remember, he'd spent years moving heaven and earth to marry her. He broke from the Pope, split England from the Catholic Church, and even risked rebellion just to put a crown on her head. That meant Anne wasn't just his wife. She was his gamble, and gambles, well, they come with expectations. So when Anne gave birth in 1533, Henry was practically bouncing in anticipation of a son. Instead, out came a healthy baby girl. Future icon Elizabeth I, yeah, but Henry at the time probably thought, seriously, I wrecked half of Christendom for this? So, Anne tried again. She became pregnant multiple times over the next few years, but each ended in tragedy, miscarriages, stillbirths, or children who didn't survive. One especially devastating blow came in 1536, when Anne miscarried what many reported as a male child. By that point, Henry was already restless, and if history teaches us anything, it's this. Henry VIII was not the stick it out and be supportive kind of husband. And here's where things get really ugly. Anne had a fiery temper and a sharp tongue, and she wasn't afraid to use them. She and Henry fought often, sometimes in front of courtiers, which was the Tudor version of airing your dirty laundry on live TV. Enemies at court, who had been sharpening their knives since the day she wore the crown, suddenly had their chance. They whispered poison into Henry's ear, that Anne was unfaithful, that she was plotting treason, that she had, well, let's just say some very inappropriate relationships, including with her own brother. But spoiler, these charges were completely ridiculous. But hey, at the time, they made for some juicy gossip. And by 1536, Henry had already moved on emotionally. His eyes had drifted toward one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, the quiet and obedient Jane Seymour. Anne, meanwhile, was about to discover that being queen didn't mean untouchable. It meant you were in the most dangerous position of all. In May of that year, Anne was arrested and hauled off to the Tower of London. Imagine the shock. Just 3 years earlier, she'd entered London as a triumphant queen, cheered by crowds. Now, she returned as a prisoner, accused of crimes so scandalous, they made even Tudor courtiers blush. Her trial was a circus. Anne defended herself with brilliance and composure, but the outcome was decided before it even began. She was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest. Basically, the Tudor trifecta of scandal. And on May 19th, 1536, Anne faced her end on Tower Green. Henry, in a rare moment of generosity, imported an expert swordsman from France to carry out her beheading swiftly, no messy hacking with an axe. Anne reportedly faced death with dignity, making a final speech where she praised Henry and prayed for his soul. Because even at the bitter end, you couldn't talk smack about the king. And with one clean stroke, the woman who changed the course of England was gone. And just like that, Henry was single again and already lining up wife number 3. So Anne's head is barely cold on the scaffold when Henry decides it's time to move on. And by move on, I don't mean after a respectful mourning period. No, Henry VIII was already eyeing his next bride, Jane Seymour, the very same woman who had been serving as one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. The sheer speed of this transition is almost comical. Anne was executed on May 9th, 1536. On May 20th, literally the next day, Henry got engaged to Jane, and by May 30th, they were married. 10 days between chopping off one wife's head and wedding the next. If Henry had Tinder, he'd be the guy swiping right in the middle of his last relationship's funeral. Now, Jane Seymour, she was very different from Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. If Catherine was the dutiful queen and Anne was the fiery rebel, Jane, well, let's just say she was super chill, quiet, obedient, and known for her mild temperament. Jane was everything Henry wanted after years of drama. She didn't argue with him in public, she didn't outshine him, and she definitely didn't try to play political chess with the court. Jane was the human equivalent of a soothing cup of tea, and for Henry, this was perfect. He didn't want another sparring partner, he wanted a wife who would nod, smile, and most importantly, deliver him that long-awaited male heir. And guess what? Jane delivered. In 1537, she gave birth to Prince Edward, the future Edward VI, and Henry was over the moon. At last, the son he had torn England apart for had arrived. Henry declared Jane his true and beloved wife, which, considering his track record, was basically the highest honor a woman could hope for. But the Tudor curse, it struck again. Just days after giving Henry the son he craved, Jane passed away from postnatal complications. And here's the kicker. Out of all 6 wives, Jane Seymour was the only one Henry ever gave a royal burial beside. That's right, the wife he knew for the shortest time, the one he basically scooped up on his way home from Anne Boleyn's execution, ended up being his one true love, which really tells you everything you need to know about King Henry VIII. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry was single again, and for once, not by choice. He was genuinely devastated after Jane died, mostly because she gave him the son he'd always wanted. But Henry, being Henry, he wasn't about to stay single for long, and by this point, his advisors were basically playing matchmaker, like it was a high-stakes episode of The Bachelor, only Tudor edition. Enter Anne of Cleves. She wasn't from some tiny noble family. She was the sister of the Duke of Cleves, a strategically important German territory. In other words, she came with political benefits, an alliance against France and the Holy Roman Empire, which sounded pretty good to Henry's council. So, they began negotiations for marriage. Now here's where the drama begins. Henry had never met Anne in person, and naturally, he wanted to know what she looked like. No selfies, no FaceTime. So what do you do in the 1500s? Well, you send a portrait. Famous painter Hans Holbein was dispatched to capture Anne's likeness, and apparently he did an excellent job. When Henry saw the painting, he was smitten, convinced she was beautiful, graceful, and exactly what he wanted. But here's the problem. Holbein was basically the Tudor version of Photoshop. He didn't paint Anne unattractive. He just, let's say, emphasized her best angles. So when Anne finally arrived in England in 1540, Henry rushed to meet her in disguise because apparently he thought surprising his bride while dressed like a random guy off the street was romantic. But spoiler, it wasn't. Anne didn't recognize him, didn't swoon, and in fact, she was kind of awkward about it. Henry's ego shattered. He stormed off, muttering that she was nothing like her portrait. When he finally saw her properly, his verdict was brutal. Henry famously declared that Anne was nothing so fair as she had been shown, and complained that he found her unattractive. Courtiers whispered that he called her Flanders mare. Yikes. Still, the wedding had to go ahead. England needed that alliance, and Henry couldn't exactly send her packing at the church door. And on January 6, 1540, Anne of Cleves became Henry's fourth queen. But here's the kicker. Henry hated it from day one. On their wedding night, he made a half-hearted attempt to consummate the marriage, but later told his advisors that, it's not happening. He claimed Anne's body wasn't appealing to him, and even went as far as saying he could not be stirred to do it. Translation: Henry had performance issues, and he decided to blame his new wife. For 6 awkward months, Anne was queen in name only. Henry barely saw her, avoided sharing a bed, and was already infatuated with someone else, a pretty young lady in waiting named Catherine Howard. Poor Anne, meanwhile, was completely out of her depth. She didn't speak much English, she wasn't raised in the cutthroat world of Tudor politics, and suddenly, she was caught in the middle of Henry's midlife crisis. By July of 1540, Henry had had enough. He demanded an annulment, claiming the marriage had never been consummated. And Anne, instead of fighting it like Catherine of Aragon or facing the axe like Anne Boleyn, she agreed, quickly, probably thinking, you know what, I'm good. I'll take the divorce settlement and I'm just gonna go. And honestly, she won the Tudor divorce lottery. Anne gave her a generous settlement, castles, money, land, and the prestigious title of the king's beloved sister. She got to live in comfort, free from Henry's tantrums, free from the danger of the executioner, and free to enjoy the rest of her life without any royal drama. She even attended Henry's court as a kind of honorary guest and outlived him by a full decade. So in the end, the so-called ugly wife turned out to be the smartest survivor of the whole bunch. By the time Henry had dumped Anne of Cleves, he was in his late 40s. His once athletic body had ballooned from years of feasting, jousting injuries, and leg ulcers that never healed. In other words, he was no longer the dashing Renaissance prince. He was overweight, moody, and constantly in pain. But in Henry's mind, he was still God's gift to women. Enter Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, and the teenage niece of the ambitious Duke of Norfolk. Catherine was young, vibrant, and full of energy. Everything Henry wasn't. Some sources say she was just 17 when she caught his attention, while Henry was pushing 50. Catherine had been raised in the household of her step-grandmother, where discipline was, let's just say, a little bit lacking. The girls in that house were basically left unsupervised. and Catherine grew up in an environment filled with flirtations and secret romances. So by the time she arrived at Henry's court as a lady-in-waiting, she already had experience with men, though not the kind of experience you wanted the king to find out about later. When Henry met her, he was instantly smitten. Catherine was cheerful, affectionate, and called him her rose without a thorn, which is honestly hilarious. She flattered him, doted on him, and made him feel young again. To Henry, Catherine wasn't just a new wife. She was a fountain of youth. Within weeks of his annulment from Anne of Cleves, Henry married Catherine in July of 1540. For a short while, Henry was ecstatic. He showered his teenage bride with gifts, jewels, and praise. He paraded her around court like a trophy, convinced that he'd finally found happiness again. Catherine, for her part, seemed to enjoy the luxury and the attention. But it wasn't long before cracks started to show. Because Catherine had secrets. Before marrying Henry, she'd been involved with several men, including a music teacher named Henry, and later, a gentleman named Francis. These relationships weren't exactly innocent, and when whispers of her past reached Henry's enemies at court, the king's enemies had found a bombshell waiting to explode. But Catherine's past wasn't her only problem. Even as Henry doted on her, she allegedly began a new affair, this time with a handsome courtier named Thomas. And unlike her earlier flings, this one happened while she was queen. The pair supposedly met in secret, aided by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn. Yeah, the same Jane Boleyn who had been involved in Anne Boleyn's downfall. Tudor court really was a small world. When the rumors reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, he quietly investigated. By late 1541, the evidence was overwhelming. Henry was told that his young queen, his rose without a thorn, had not only been soiled before their marriage, but might actually be cheating on him right under his nose. The king's reaction was nothing short of catastrophic. Henry reportedly broke down in tears, claiming he had loved Catherine more than any of his other wives. The betrayal cut him deeply, but once the shock wore off, Henry did what Henry always did. He reached for the axe. Catherine was arrested, along with Francis, Thomas, and Jane Boleyn. The men were brutally executed by hanging and quartering. Jane Boleyn, once again tangled in scandal, was also executed. Catherine herself, she was locked in the Tower of London. On February 13th, 1542, she was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. Barely out of her teenage years, Catherine faced her fate with as much composure as she could muster. According to legend, the night before her execution, she asked to practice placing her head on the block, as if rehearsing for her final performance. When the day came, she spoke a prayer, laid her head down, and the axe fell. And just like that, Henry had burned through wife number 5, this time losing the woman who was supposed to make him feel young again. Instead, he was left older, angrier, and more paranoid than ever. By the time Henry was ready for wife number 6, he was, well, a wreck. He was obese, riddled with infections, and had the temperament of a toddler with a toothache. The man who had once dazzled Europe as a golden prince was now a bloated, limping monarch, propped up by servants and lashing out at anyone who displeased him. Most women would have run for the hills, but Catherine Parr, she walked right into the storm. Catherine was born into a respectable but not overly powerful family, and by the time she caught Henry's eye, she was already twice widowed. That made her unusual in Harry's lineup. Unlike the fresh-faced teenagers before her, Catherine was mature, experienced, and savvy. She had been around long enough to know how dangerous marriage could be for a woman, and marrying this particular man, that was like volunteering to play Russian roulette with 6 bullets. But Catherine didn't really have a choice. Henry wanted her, and when Henry wanted something, saying no, well, it wasn't a safe option. To make things even more complicated, Catherine was actually in love with someone else, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. She reportedly tried to turn Henry down, but her family pushed her into the marriage. In 1543, at age 31, Catherine Parr became Henry's 6th and final wife. Now here's where she stands out. Catherine wasn't just trying to survive Henry. She actually thrived in his court. She was highly educated, deeply religious, and politically astute. She acted as a nurse to Henry in his final years, tending to his festering leg wounds and managing his household with efficiency. But she also went further than any of Henry's other wives. She became an advocate for religious reform, published her own writings, and even managed to play peacemaker in Henry's famously dysfunctional family. Catherine worked tirelessly to reconcile Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, bringing the fractured Tudor line back together in a way that nobody else could. But here's the thing about Henry VIII. Even when you were doing everything right, you were never truly safe. Catherine's reformist religious views put her in the crosshairs of conservative factions at court, who whispered to Henry that she was pushing dangerous ideas, even hearsay. And hearsay, in Tudor England, was a one-way ticket to the executioner. At one point, a warrant for her arrest was actually drawn up. Catherine, realizing she was about to become wife number 6 with no head, pulled off a masterclass in survival. She went to Henry, feigned humility, and told him that she had already debated theology with him because she wanted to distract him from his pain and learn from his superior wisdom. It was a dangerous lie, but Henry's ego lapped it all up. And just like that, the warrant was quietly dropped. Catherine had outplayed the king himself. In January of 1547, Henry had finally passed away, leaving behind a 9-year-old son, Edward VI, and the battered remains of his once glorious dynasty. And for the first time in nearly 4 decades, one of Henry's wives was free. Catherine Parr, the nurse, the diplomat, the reformer, and the survivor, had beaten the odds. Of course, this is Tudor history, so her story didn't end in a peaceful, happily ever after. Catherine remarried quickly, this time to her old love, Thomas Seymour, but that relationship turned messy really quickly. Still, she had done what none of Henry's other wives could. She'd walked into the Tudor death trap and walked back out, alive. And so, with Catherine Parr's unlikely survival, Henry VIII's parade of wives finally came to an end. 6 queens, 6 very different stories, some tragic, some triumphant, and all unforgettable. But while the fates of his wives are fascinating enough, their true significance lies in what they left behind, Henry's heirs. Because at the end of the day, everything Henry did, the divorces, the executions, the broken alliances, the split from the Catholic Church, it was all driven by one burning obsession, producing children who could secure the Tudor dynasty. And oh, the irony. For all his scheming and wife-swapping, Henry VIII only ended up with 3 legitimate children who survived to adulthood: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. No sprawling dynasty of strong sons to cement his legacy, just 1 boy and 2 girls. And yet, those 3 children would go on to shape England's future in ways Henry himself probably never even imagined. Each of them carried the weight of their mother's story. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, grew up scarred by her mother's humiliation and her father's ruthless rejection. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was dismissed at birth as a disappointment, but would rise to become one of the most powerful monarchs in English history. And Edward, Jane Seymour's long-awaited son, was Henry's golden child, the boy Henry sacrificed so much for, but his reign would prove tragically short. Together, these three siblings inherited not just the crown, but the chaos Henry left behind: religious conflict, dynasty insecurity, and the impossible task of living up to their father's towering, destructive legacy. So let's leave the wives behind for a moment and turn to the children of Henry VIII, the three heirs who would each wear the crown, each rule in their own way, and each leave behind a legacy that changed England forever. We'll start with the eldest, Mary Tudor, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Born in 1516, Mary was Henry's first legitimate child, and for a time, she was the apple of her father's eye. As a little girl, she was adorned by her parents, doted on by courtiers, and celebrated as a symbol of Tudor strength. She was bright, precocious, and extremely well educated. Her mother, Catherine, she made sure of it. Mary could play musical instruments, speak multiple languages, and had a keen mind for politics and religion. For her early years, she was raised to believe that she would one day rule in her own right, since Henry still didn't have a son. But everything changed when Henry decided he wanted to cast Catherine aside for Anne Boleyn. Imagine being a child and watching your father publicly humiliate your mother, declare their marriage invalid, and label you illegitimate. That's exactly what happened to Mary, practically overnight. The adored princess became a political pawn with no secure future. She was stripped of her title, forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her baby half-sister Elizabeth, and forbidden from seeing her own mother. Catherine was exiled and died in isolation, and Henry wouldn't even allow Mary to say goodbye. This trauma left deep scars. Mary grew up feeling humiliated, resentful, and fiercely protective of her mother's memory. She clung to Catholicism, the faith of Catherine of Aragon, and grew up to despise Anne Boleyn and everything she represented. That bitterness, it never really left her. And when Henry finally passed away in 1547, the crown went to her half-brother, Edward VI, the 9-year-old son of Jane Seymour. Edward was a staunch Protestant, and under his reign, the Protestant Reformation accelerated, undoing what little Catholic influence remained in England. For Mary, this was like salt in an open wound. She refused to conform, openly practiced being a Catholic, and clashing with Edward's ministers. And by the time Edward passed away young in 1553, the stage was set for a showdown. Edward tried to bypass Mary in his will, naming Lady Jane Grey, Protestant cousin, as his heir. But Mary, she wasn't having it. She rallied supporters, stormed into the political scene with all the fire and fury her mother had once shown, and within days, she swept Lady Jane off the throne and declared herself queen. At 37 years old, after decades of suffering, Mary Tudor was finally crowned Mary I of England. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Mary was determined to undo the Protestant reforms that had pushed her mother and herself into disgrace. She brought Catholicism back to England and married Philip II of Spain, a match deeply unpopular with her people. She believed she was doing God's work, but her methods were brutal. Hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake for heresy, and her reign of terror earned her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. To make matters worse, Mary's personal life was filled with disappointment. She desperately longed for a child to secure the Catholic future of England, but she suffered what historians now believe were phantom pregnancies. symptoms of pregnancy without an actual baby. Twice she announced she was expecting, only to end in humiliation when no child arrived. The tragic irony? Henry had turned the world upside down to secure a son, and his only surviving daughter, with Catherine of Aragon, endured a lifetime of reproductive heartbreak. Mary reigned for just 5 years, from 1553 to 1558. When she passed away childless at the age of 42, her dreams of restoring Catholic England had died with her. Her half-sister Elizabeth succeeded her, the very daughter of Anne Boleyn, Mary's greatest enemy. It was a cruel twist of fate that Mary's bitter rival would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Mary I remains one of history's most controversial queens, remembered as a tyrant by some, a tragic figure by others. But one thing is certain, her life was shaped entirely by the choices Henry VIII made, and by the brutal treatment of her mother. In many ways, Mary's story is Catherine of Aragon's story, continued, with all the same pain and defiance. Next up, Elizabeth Tudor. Born in 1533 to Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth entered the world with all the fanfare Henry VIII could muster, and then immediately disappointed him by being a girl. After all, Henry had torn apart the Catholic Church, humiliated Catherine of Aragon, and crowned Anne Queen, all in hopes of getting a son. And what did he get? Baby Elizabeth. You can almost hear Henry grumbling, "I didn't risk eternal damnation for this." At first, Henry doted on her anyway. She was a lively, clever child, and Anne adored her. But when Anne Boleyn fell from grace and into the hands of the executioner, Elizabeth's status, well, it crumbled too. She was stripped of her title, declared illegitimate, and shoved to the side. So picture this. The future Gloriana, the legendary Queen of England, spending her childhood basically in a royal afterthought. But Elizabeth had something her half-sister Mary never quite mastered: survival instincts. She learned very young how to smile, flatter, and play the political game without ever showing her full hand. When her father remarried, again and again and again, Elizabeth, she adapted. She charmed Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, who helped ensure Elizabeth received one of the finest education of any woman in Europe. By her teens, Elizabeth could write in Latin and Greek, speak French and Italian, and deliver speeches sharp enough to slice through Tudor court intrigue. When Henry passed away in 1547, Elizabeth was still technically illegitimate, but she was too smart and too visible to be ignored. She lived quietly through her brother Edward VI's short reign, keeping her head down during his Protestant reforms, and somehow managed not to get herself executed during Mary I's bloody crackdown. That alone was a political miracle. At one point, Elizabeth was even thrown in the Tower of London on suspicion of plotting against Mary. But unlike her mother Anne, Elizabeth knew how to tread carefully. She played the innocent, denied everything, and she waited. And then, in 1558, fate handed her the crown. Mary died childless, and Elizabeth, the so-called unwanted daughter, illegitimate princess, and political pawn, became Queen Elizabeth I, the Queen of England. Her reign would last 45 years, and it was nothing short of transformative. She steered England through religious chaos by crafting a compromise between Catholic and Protestant factions, kept foreign powers like Spain at bay, and oversaw the cultural explosion we now call the Elizabethan Age. Shakespeare, exploration, the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Elizabeth's reign, it had it all. And she did it without ever marrying. Instead, she turned her single status into a power move, branding herself the Virgin Queen, who was married only to her country. Basically, she was the Tudor queen who said, "Who needs a man? I run a kingdom." And the irony is delicious. The child Henry dismissed, as a failure, turned out to be the most successful monarch of the entire Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth not only outshone her father, but defined an era so glorious that they named it after her. Not bad for a kid who started life as her dad's biggest disappointment. And now we come to Henry's golden child, the one he risked everything for, Edward VI. Born in 1537 to Jane Seymour, Edward was the prize Henry had been waiting decades to unwrap. At long last, a son, a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty, Henry was so ecstatic that he declared Jane his true wife and gave her a royal burial when she passed away shortly after childbirth. That alone tells you how much this little boy meant to him. From the moment of his birth, Edward's entire existence was treated like the answer to England's prayers. He was showered with tutors, guarded like a treasure, and raised to embody the Protestant future Henry had engineered through his messy divorces and church breakups. Unlike his sisters, who were tossed around, declared illegitimate, and used as pawns in Henry's marital circus, Edward's life was carefully curated. He studied religion, politics, languages, and math, because in Henry's mind, this boy was destined to rule as the perfect king. But here's the tragic irony. Edward became king at just 9 years old. When Henry passed away in 1547, the Tudor throne passed to a boy who was still years away from puberty. Obviously, a 9-year-old can't actually run a kingdom, so the real power landed in the hands of his regents. First, his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and later, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. These guys basically used Edward as a puppet while they fought each other for control, all under the banner of protecting the boy king. Still, Edward wasn't completely sidelined. He took his role seriously and was a committed Protestant, even more so than his father. During his reign, the Church of England's Protestant identity was locked into place. Catholic rituals were stripped away, new prayer books were enforced, and the foundation of modern Anglicanism began to solidify. For reformers, Edward's reign was a golden opportunity to push England further from Rome. But Edward's body couldn't keep up with the demands of kingship. He was frail, he was sickly, and by his mid-teens, it was clear he was dying of tuberculosis. For a king whose entire existence had been built on the idea of dynasty, this was catastrophic. The Tudor line that Henry had ripped apart England for to preserve was suddenly on the verge of collapse. And Edward, being his father's son, tried to control the succession from beyond the grave. He deliberately excluded his Catholic sister Mary from inheriting the throne, fearing she would undo all his Protestant reforms. Instead, he named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir, a teenage girl who wanted nothing to do with the crown. This sparked one of the messiest chapters of Tudor history, a 9-day disaster that ended with Jane's execution and Mary seizing power anyway. And Edward VI passed away at just 15 years old in 1553. All the hope, all the pressure, all the expectations Henry had poured into his one fragile child, gone in less than a decade. So in the end, Henry VIII's desperate quest for a son gave him exactly what he wanted, but only briefly. Edward may have worn the crown, but it was his sisters, the daughters Henry had dismissed, sidelined, and disowned, who would leave the lasting mark on England. So that covers Henry's legitimate heirs, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, the only ones who survived to sit on the throne. But here's the thing. For a man who was so obsessed with producing children, Henry VIII, well, let's just say he had a complicated track record outside of marriage too. Because while he only officially acknowledged 3 true heirs, Henry wasn't exactly living a life of monk-like restraint. He had affairs, mistresses, and whispers of children scattered across court gossip. But did any of them matter? Well, one did, and his story is fascinating. Henry VIII's only acknowledged illegitimate child was Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Born in 1519, Fitzroy was the son of Henry and his mistress Elizabeth Blount, a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Unlike most illegitimate children of kings, Fitzroy wasn't quietly swept under the rug. Henry adored him. He gave the boy grand titles, lands, and even a place in the line of succession conversations. In fact, at one point, Henry toyed with the idea of legitimizing Fitzroy and naming him heir. That's how desperate he was for a male successor. Fitzroy grew up surrounded by wealth and privilege, even marrying Mary Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, as a teenager. But like so many Tudors, his health failed him. In 1536, at just 17 years old, Fitzroy passed away of tuberculosis. His death was a huge blow for Henry, who had once seen the boy as a safety net for the Tudor dynasty. With Fitzroy gone, Henry's obsession with producing more legitimate sons through marriage only intensified. As for the rumors of other illegitimate children, they've swirled for centuries. Some historians argue that Henry might have fathered more children with other mistresses, like Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister. In fact, Mary had 2 children, Catherine and Henry, during the time she was romantically linked to Henry. It's never been proven whether Henry VIII was their father officially. The king never really acknowledged them. But the timing makes it a juicy possibility. The kids went on to hold influential positions at court, and Elizabeth I certainly treated them with unusual favor. Still, for all the rumors, Fitzroy remains the only illegitimate child King Henry VIII ever recognized, and his early death just added more fuel to Henry's desperate scramble for sons, a scramble that ended up costing 6 women their peace, their dignity, and in some cases, their lives. And so the story of Henry VIII comes full circle. 6 wives, countless mistresses, 1 acknowledged bastard, 3 legitimate heirs, and yet, no matter how hard he fought, schemed, and executed, his desperate obsession with controlling his dynasty slipped right through his fingers. Catherine of Aragon gave him loyalty. Anne Boleyn gave him revolution. Jane Seymour gave him a son. Anne of Cleves gave him freedom. Catherine Howard gave him scandal. And Catherine Parr gave him survival. 6 women, each shaping Henry's reign in their own way, and each paying the price for being married to the most dangerous man in England. And what of the children he fought so hard to secure? Edward, the long-awaited boy, gone before his beard had even grown in. Mary, scarred by humiliation, remembered as Bloody Mary. Elizabeth, the unwanted daughter of the disgraced Anne Boleyn, who rose from illegitimacy to become one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Even Henry Fitzroy, the son he never meant to have, was taken by death before he could become more than a tantalizing what if. In the end, Henry VIII left behind no strong line of Tudor sons, no dynasty of heirs to carry on his name. Instead, his true legacy came from the very daughters he had once dismissed as disappointments. Mary and Elizabeth, the women he cast into the shadows, ended up defining the future of England far more than Henry could have ever imagined. Henry VIII wanted control. What he got was chaos, rebellion, heartbreak, and irony. His reign was a storm, and the women and children caught in its path, they paid the price. But out of all the chaos rose some of the most unforgettable figures in English history. So the next time you hear the old rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, remember, behind those neat little words are stories of ambition, betrayal, tragedy, and resilience. Stories that remind us that history isn't just about kings who shout orders, but about the queens and the children who lived, and too often died, in their shadow. Henry VIII may have thought he was shaping his family. In reality, his family shaped him, and in the end, they outlived his legend. And that's it for this video, you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. And let me know if you have any other topics you'd want me to cover. And with that, I'll see you later. Good night.